Trigger warning.
It's Thanksgiving, and you know what that means. As you try and enjoy some downtime with your family, you'll undoubtedly find yourself sitting across from a social justice warrior at your Thanksgiving table trying to force-feed you white guilt. After all, it's your ancestors who committed mass genocide against the Indians. I'm sorry, Native Americans. I'm sorry, indigenous? The ones who do the mouth thing. We'll play it safe and go with Redskins. Only one problem. What they're trying to feed you is unadulterated, plain roaming buffalo feces. All right, to preface this, yes, there were some heinous crimes committed on behalf of the settlers, Europeans, that are unforgivable, and I've benefited as a result with white privilege, blah, 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 but some of the BS needs to be called out. Civilizations clash. That's happened since the beginning of time. Yes, war sucks, but it doesn't give the right to leftist teachers, social justice warriors to lie about a non-existent horseback culture, peaceful Native American who was taken out by smallpox blankets and painted with colors of the wind.
How?
So before you dummies hang that dream catcher from your rear view mirror, that's another problem we'll talk about. Are you planning to fall asleep at the wheel? You're a jackass. I don't care if you do have a dream catcher in your car. You fall asleep at the wheel with over 2 tons of steel, glass, and gasoline behind you. It's going to be a bad dream. No one wakes up from that refreshed. But it's time to put your surgical mask on like Japanese do in the face of SARS, because you're about to smell some sacred cows being burned. Let's debunk some of the most common politically correct Thanksgiving myths. Myth: the Native Americans were a peaceful culture to whom the concept of war was foreign. Fact: many tribes were conquering assholes. Native Americans warred with each other since forever. Sometimes it was over hunting or farming grounds, sometimes it was revenge. But the truth is, the only way settlers were able to conquer this land was with the assistance of Native Americans themselves, who wanted to settle the score with other who they viewed to be more Polish tribes than themselves. You think Cortez took over stuff with 500 conquistadors? No, it was the 50,000 plus Native Americans who'd had it up to here with being enslaved, raped, brutally tortured, and forced to carry gold for the other native Aztecs. Same thing further north. The big strategy of the Europeans wasn't to kill everybody. You give some tribes some fire, water, and boom boom sticks, let them do the dirty work.
Here! Have fun!
Some of the Redskin tribes were the most brutal in existence. Some of them practiced enslavement, rape, cannibalism. They would sometimes target women and children. For example, the Comanches would butcher babies and roast people alive. And where do you think we learned the fine art of scalping?
But Father, what's that Indian doing?
No, we mustn't say Indians, they're indigenous.
The indigenous. What's that indigenous doing?
I agree, it is rather curious.
Hey guys!
Myth: Native Americans were an advanced society. Truth: not even close. Smell that? It's your sacred cow and it's already extra well done. Don't worry, I scalped her first and made the other cows watch. Unlike ancient Rome, Greece, China, or really any other advanced empire that had existed long before we came here with the Native Americans, they didn't have any kind of advanced plumbing, transportation, mathematics, or really anything that's led to you watching this right now on your iPhone.
Oh, you're just being ethnocentric.
Yes. That whole beautiful horseback Indian culture you read about, it's a lie. They hadn't even domesticated horses. Not only that, they didn't use the wheel. No, really. 1400 AD, no wheel.
I say, good man, why don't you just roll it? You know, roll it. Roll.
I know this one's not a moral argument. The point is, when you're that far behind, the clash of civilizations is that much worse when the wheel-using New World catches up to you. Myth: the settlers deliberately infected Native Americans with smallpox blankets to wipe them out. Truth: only idiots could believe this. Think about this for a second. You believe that Europeans waged microbial biological warfare years before discovery, mass acceptance, or even acknowledgement of advanced germ theory.
Here, Father, give them these. They're riddled with germs.
What do you mean? What's a germ?
Well, they're like microscopic organisms, but you can't see them.
You can't see it. Is it magic?
Not quite like magic, but...
He's a witch, Ben!
Here's a witch! I'm not a witch!
He's definitely a witch, this one.
Oh my God!
You can search high and low for legitimate historical accounts of smallpox blankets being mass pajamagrammed to peaceful Native Americans, but you won't find it. However, there is some truth to the myth, which brings me to my next point. Myth: Europeans deliberately committed mass genocide, wiping out every last native for sport. Truth. Nope. This brings back in our last point. It is estimated that as high as 95% of Native Americans were actually taken out by diseases. Why? Because Europeans brought with them new diseases to which the natives weren't immune, not only themselves, but with animals with which the Native Americans had had no contact with, because again, they hadn't yet domesticated horses. Again, not judging just because of the lack of advancement as a society. No horses or wheel. No wheel. Sure, there were plenty of bloody, horrendous, unimaginable conflicts that did occur, and when dealing with a more barbaric society and new settlers, generally speaking in warfare, the guys with the boom sticks win. This isn't exclusive to America, and it's not all uncommon. But Europeans weren't hell-bent on destroying every single last indigenous person. As a matter of fact, they were encouraged to reach out to them and try and bring them into the culture and convert them to Christianity. Plus, intermarrying was incredibly common. How else do you explain Angelina Jolie, Johnny Depp, Kid Cudi, and even imaginary Elizabeth Warren claiming to be 1/16th Cherokee?
She's quite pretty, Father.
Yes, she is.
Totally, how?
She makes me feel warm in my wobbly bits.
My bits, too.
In summation, killing is bad, but so is milking, misleading, and guilting future generations for crimes they never committed. Yes, Europeans conquered the Native Americans, instituted a constitutional republic, and advanced in a mere couple centuries what Native Americans weren't able to do for thousands of years beforehand. Yes, it was violent, but once contact has been made, you can't go back. If today we never came here, they saw a plane, guess what? It's gonna start some So turn off this smartphone, go enjoy some turkey with your family, and be sure to tell your social justice warrior cousin at the table to shut his mustached, single-origin coffee drinking hole. If that doesn't work, just hand him a smallpox napkin.
If you like this video, subscribe. Sure, many of these depictions are not historically accurate. They didn't have Buffalo Trace or 357 Magnums, but here we are!
No one's getting past me.
Yes, they are, because it's estimated that between 27 and 40% of all undocumented immigrants in America came here on planes.
27 to 40% of our people coming on planes, he goes on to say, overstaying their visas. Got it. Have you done the math yet? That means at minimum 60% of illegal immigration doesn't occur from planes and visas. Adam Ruins Everything is a show. I've actually really liked Adam Ruins Everything on quite a few things. They've taken some sort of, I guess, libertarian stances, but generally speaking, it's pretty informative. This is one where they were completely wrong. If you're listening to it, it could sound plausible, what he says, but I've got some information here that might just smack you over the head. So let's roll the first clip.
La verdad es que la pared no lograría nada. Building a wall would actually increase the number of illegal immigrants in America.
Nope.
What? How could it possibly?
Here, I'll show you.
First off, that is not true. Let me tell you something here. A book that I recommend. It's up on my page, Stolen Sovereignty, How to Stop Unelected Judges from Transforming America. Daniel Horowitz. He talks about illegal immigration quite a bit in a way that is very informative and very enlightening.
No one's getting past me.
Yes, they are, because it's estimated that between 27 and 40% of all undocumented immigrants in America came here on planes.
I forgot about planes.
And that's just said so flippantly, right? Oh, building a wall because 27 to 40% of our people coming on planes, he goes on to say, overstaying their visas. Got it. Have you done the math yet? That means at minimum 60% of illegal immigration doesn't occur from planes and visas.
Some would call that a majority,
Up to 73%. At least not planes and visas. So here's the deal. Does it mean that a wall will fix everything? No one's saying that. But if you could have some sort of an effect on, let's use the most conservative figure, 60% of illegal immigration by his own admission, how is that not significant enough to build a wall? Joe Rogan talks about this. If you had a ham sandwich that was 60% crap and 40% ham, you'd probably want do something about the crap. It's still 60% crap. So the number there right off the bat.
It's like most hot dogs. That's the percentage.
That's just true. The number right there right off the bat should concern you. It debunks the entire argument. If you believe that even curbing that pesky little 60 to 70% is worthwhile, you don't even need to watch the rest of the video. I do. I assume many of you do. Let's assume you say, you know what? I'll give them 60 to 70%.
It would easily be one of the single most expensive pieces of infrastructure in American history, costing as much as 20 Hoover dams or NASA's entire annual budget.
Just an annual budget?
So not that
Just
much.
one?
One annual budget? This is supposed to turn us off?
I say we turn NASA off for a year.
Turn NASA off. Just throttle
Clock
it
out.
for a year, like the UN will do with the internet.
Yep.
Throttle it a little bit and just start putting up the wall. It is that's not that expensive, particularly when you look at the economic ramifications. Positive ones when you stop illegal immigration. Next clip.
Even by your estimate of visa overstays, the wall would still stop about half of America's 11 million illegal immigrants.
No, it wouldn't, because of a little something called circular flow. Here, I'll show you. For decades, immigration to the U.S. was a circular flow. People would come, work for a bit, and then after they were done, go home to their families.
That's morally reprehensible. That was never what America was intended to be. It wasn't intended to be a revolving door so people could come in, abuse a system, and leave. You don't come to a country to drain from the country to send to other countries. That's not how a country works. That's not being ethnocentric. That's not being xenophobic. That's called having a country, okay? The revolving door, they talk about people coming in revolving door to work and send back benefits. That's not right. You don't get to do that. You move here legally, period, right? We've already covered that. But the revolving door for work is very different from a revolving door for entitlements. People are going through the revolving door right now and not paying for health care and not paying taxes and getting all of the social benefits, the benefits from the social safety net from hardworking Americans. It's never supposed to be a revolving door. And it's worse now because a lot of illegal immigrants aren't really coming here to work. Not all of them, but many of them are coming here and they're taking more than they're giving.
It's not like working in New York and then living in New Jersey.
No,
it's a little bit different.
It's a little bit different.
different.
Next clip.
It's counterintuitive, but building a wall wouldn't stop people from coming in. It would actually stop them from going back.
The number of illegal border crossings is actually at an all-time low.
No, that's not true. I have it up right here. Washington Examiner. Illegal border crossings by children and families are surging again and will put the fiscal year of 2016 on par with 2014. There's a chart for you. Here's why. Listen, at a certain point, of course, immigration is going to start slowing down because Mexico has dumped a tenth. 10% of its population have moved to the United States. So at a certain point, you're going to hit a critical mass of how many people can leave their crappy country to a better country, the United States. 10%, 12, maybe it'll go back to 8. It'll hover around there. Now, here's why this chart occurred. Because of the deportations, as they've plummeted, more people have been coming back in, and now we're facing the surge that we had in 2014. So the inverse is true of what they've said. As deportations have plummeted, as Barack Obama tried to act, and really what's happened is people are being treated more humanely they would. There's now all of a sudden we see this. You can see this sort of like a fat caterpillar in the graph. We have a problem with illegal immigration again, of course, and the problems that come with that. Draining on the system, the problem of the social safety net, of fiscal responsibility. Do we have more clips?
Oh my God, Adam, you're right. The wall isn't the answer.
Oh, good. I'm so glad I could help.
Millions of people are already here. We need to deport them. Yes, deportation is the answer.
No.
All right, there you go. Because of course it's racist to deport people who've broken the law to come here illegally. Again, that's that sleight of hand. It starts off with, well, it would only help with maybe half, maybe 60, 73%. And so if you just hear that, you don't even think about it. You're thinking you heard 10%. You go, well, then that's silly. Why would we spend the whole NASA budget to stop 10%? No, you're spending actually a very reasonable budget, and we can get Mexico to pay for at least a portion of it if you look at the actual plans and tariffs and what you can do with the transfer of money. Donald Trump isn't completely unrealistic to get them to pay for a portion of it. You can pay for that. It's realistic, and that would deal with 60 to 70-something% of illegal immigration. But if you don't understand what you're hearing, you go along with them down that logic trail and you follow them with false stat, false idea, false narrative to the point where deportation is racist, and you get to call Donald Trump or people like us racist, people like me who come from legal immigrants like my mom who learn the language, who pay taxes, who are active contributing citizens. This idea that we don't take in enough legal immigrants, it's just not true. It's not even close. 50% of all immigrants since 1965 have come from Latin America, 29 from Mexico alone. That's not even taking into account people who come here illegally, who overstay visas. More people have come to the United States from Mexico than any other country in our modern history, okay? Over the past 44 years, I have these numbers. 6.65 million people have emigrated legally to the United States, compared to the previous world record holder, Italy, 4.5 million. It's not even close. This idea that we don't take enough Mexicans in legally, that it's incredibly hard. More legal people have come to the United States from Mexico by an unbelievable margin. It can be done. It's been done from Mexico more than any other country, and of course it's been done by plenty of other countries. So building a wall, beefing up the security, well, you have to decide, is it worth it to spend a relatively small amount to stop 60 to 70% of illegal immigration? I don't know. I leave that to you.
Hey, Jared's laughing. This video is taken from the full weekly podcast, Louder with Crowder. Subscribe by clicking it. Jared's laughing because he just got shot. The loss of blood is making him delirious. Who shot him?
Comparing democratic socialism to traditional socialism, or God forbid communism, is fear-mongering. It's inaccurate. It's actually pretty reasonable.
We need to unite and work together if we're all going to get through this.
Sounds like socialism to me.
Democratic socialism.
What's the difference?
Huge difference.
Except that it's not. Here's Bernie Sanders when asked, describing democratic socialism.
And what democratic socialism is about is saying that it is immoral and wrong that the top 1/10 of 1% in this country own almost 90%, own almost as much wealth as the bottom 90%. You see every other major country providing health care to all people as a right, except the United States. Those are some of the principles that I believe in, and I think we should look to countries like Denmark, like Sweden, and Norway, and learn from what they have accomplished for their working people.
Okay, this is pivotal because there's a myth going around that democratic socialism is inherently different from traditional socialism. Bernie Sanders did not articulate a worldview there at all. He just pointed to things that have existed since the beginning of time, told you that you should be angry, that you deserve stuff, and presented you with a Christmas wish list. That's not a worldview. That's how you buy votes.
It's time for Who Do You Trust? Hubba, hubba, hubba. Money, money, money. Who do you trust? Me? I'm giving away free money.
Allow me to contrast. If someone asked me, what is conservatism or federalism or constitutionalism, whatever you want to call it? It's pretty simple. My worldview inherently believes that individuals, when left and given the freedom to make their own decisions, tend to do so more effectively than government bureaucrats in Washington. Also, I believe that it is morally imperative to provide people with said freedom and liberties. That's it. That's it. I didn't promise you any free shit. And we'll get into the nitty-gritty, but the macro is first because we'll come back to reference this. Of the two worldviews, there is only one that allows and acknowledges human nature, and one that necessitates humans be inherently altruistic, particularly those in government with a D next to their name, completely immune to corruption.
I have brought peace, freedom, justice, and security to my new empire.
Your new empire?
Don't make me kill you.
Whereas my worldview allows for the human nature of some people being good, some people being turd nuggets, and allowing them to make their own decisions, and the invisible hand of market forces to mitigate the damage, as opposed to the damage that can be done in a centralized power.
I'm your king. Well, I didn't vote for you. You don't vote for kings.
So right away, before we get into the nerdy math, and we will, you have to decide what it is that you believe. Because right away, the democratic socialists will try and poke holes in your argument.
What a lot of people may not realize is that America is kind of already a socialist country.
Some of the most obvious are things like Medicare and Social Security.
Free K-12 education.
National parks, prisons and the whole justice system.
The Postal Service.
Disposal of your toilet waste.
Even the Army are all socialist programs.
Leftists inevitably try and paint you into the corner that anything provided by government at all equates to socialism. And that comes back to the worldview. You need to understand what is the legitimate role of government, particularly in the United States. Honestly, have you ever asked yourself that fundamental question? Everything stems from it. The good thing is we have pretty clear blueprints. The Constitution is how, the Declaration of Independence is why. Definitely read those. Allow me to give you an analogy that my dad provided with me and I think is appropriate here. The role of the government, as per the documents that we have, is very similar to that of a hockey referee. Specifically hockey, you'll see why in a second. The job of a hockey referee is to ensure the safety of the players and ensure people are obeying the rules in a way that keeps the pace of the game. Keeping the players, i.e. the citizens, safe. That would mean that the military, some form of police force, is of course a legitimate role of government. Having regulations in place to ensure that people don't steal or screw other people, of course that's a legitimate role of government. Anything beyond that purview is considered incidental, and the referee in hockey keeps his whistle in his pocket. Also, there's a certain element of self-regulation to hockey not seen in other sports, which one can appreciate.
Two dropping as Spencer comes in and he goes down.
Contrast that with the European socialists in soccer. It's a very clearly defined role. The referee's job is not to pick winners, losers, high scorers, to provide medical assistance, to be a water boy or a cheerleader, or even to draft the teams. So I don't want to get too far off into the weeds, but I find it funny that democratic socialists use the post office as an example for success. The post office was awful until, surprise, FedEx provided competition. Overnight shipping, 2-day shipping, it didn't exist. It got there when it got there. You hoped. Also, before FedEx, tracking numbers didn't exist. That was your post office. You want to see government-run healthcare? Take that and add cancer. Schools are another example. Your parents were raised without a federal Department of Education. They still had public schools. They were funded by their municipalities and their states. And guess what? Results are pretty similar. Most of your parents are smarter than you. And that's the beauty, again, of the worldview of constitutionalism. There's a very limited role of the federal government in D.C., but states and municipalities have the right to enact government services that the federal government does not. If one state wants to tax you out of existence to provide schools and free weed to everybody, they're free to do so just as surely a decent state doesn't have to. Again, when accounting for human nature, you want a decentralization of government power. This groundwork has to be laid here because it's pivotal that you understand the difference between your opinion, how you would like systems to work, versus how they are legally designed to operate. So to be fair, let's go to Democratic Socialists of America and their description of democratic socialism. Democratic socialists believe that both the economy and society should be run democratically to meet public needs, not to make profits for a few. Now, right away, they say that because people hear democracy and believe that it's somehow inherently noble, and subconsciously delineates between socialism and democratic socialism. There is no difference. It's why Vladimir Lenin famously said, "Democracy is indispensable to socialism." So you may want those things, but right off the bat, the United States is not a democracy. It was never designed to be a democracy, and it will never be a democracy so long as the Constitution stands. The United States has always been a constitutional representative republic. Why, and how's it different? Because the Founding Fathers understood that for freedom to be maintained, it was pivotal that the rights of the minority were not entirely beholden to the ever-changing will of the majority. See, pure democracy sounds nice, but in reality, it's mob rule, which is why it inevitably collapses. Again, you're not accounting for human nature. If everyone has a vote, they're going to vote in their own self-interest, and the mob will vote to take stuff from the minority.
I want, me, mine, now.
Good example would be when people first came to the United States in colonies under John Smith. Prager University has a great video on this. Originally, the goal was the betterment of the community, not the individuals. So grain, food, resources were communal, and people took what they needed. What inevitably happened is some people were more productive than others, and the system began collapsing, and people starved. That invariably happens with some model of socialism. It's just a matter of time. And when that time comes, you have a decision to make. Either you go to full-fledged communism, where the government has to control all aspects of commerce, or you go the other way, free market enterprise capitalism, which is what John Smith did, saying, okay, this isn't working, everyone, you're in charge of yourself, and prompted the famous phrase, "He who does not work does not eat," which he was quoting from the Bible. Yada, yada, yada. Fast forward hundreds of years, you have an iPhone 6. Again, human nature. If you yoke yaks, if you yoke 2 yaks or a few yaks, I don't know how many can you yoke? They yoke yaks.
I don't think they yoke yaks.
I think they yoke yaks. They yoked a yak.
Oh.
If you yoke them together, they are going to move as fast as the slowest yak. Centralized forms of government do this. They pull people back. They're incapable of pulling people forward, which is why Lenin famously said of socialism, "The goal of socialism is communism." Mother Russia. Okay, let's go right back to the Democratic Socialists' own website. Democratic Socialists do not want to create an all-powerful government bureaucracy. Today, corporate executives who answer only to themselves and a few wealthy stockholders make basic economic decisions affecting millions of people. We believe that the workers and consumers who are affected by economic institutions should own and control them. Own and control them. And how are you going to do that, Democratic Socialists? Damn it. Important to note right off the bat, most businesses are not helmed by millionaires. Most of them are small businesses. By the way, who's most affected by said economic institution or business? Maybe instead of just the worker, could it possibly be, I don't know, the business owner who incurred all of the investment and risk? Yet according to the Democratic Socialists' own website, all of that control should be given over to the worker. Why? Because they said so. Who's going to do it? The government bureaucracy that they just promised wouldn't happen. Little known fact, it's going to be done at gunpoint. That's what government does. That's what taxes are. You give us this, or men with guns come and take you away.
You are one first-class idiot. Oh, really?
You may not like Walmart's wages, but when was the last time they gangster punked you? Moreover, the fall of communism should not blind us to injustices at home. We cannot allow all radicalism to be dismissed as communist. That suppression of dissent and diversity undermines America's ability to live up to its promise of equality of opportunity, not to mention the freedoms of speech and assembly. Okay, here's just the point where I'll ask you to point me to any socialist government that allows for freedom of speech. In the short term, we can't eliminate private corporations, but we can bring them under greater democratic control. The government could use regulations and tax incentives to encourage companies to act in the public interest. Key detail here, in the short term, we can't eliminate private corporations, which would imply, in the long term, the goal is to eliminate private corporations. That sounds familiar.
The way to crush the bourgeoisie is to grind them between the millstones of taxation and inflation.
Thanks, Cutout Lenin, for refreshing my memory. So the goal is to discourage companies from acting in the interest of you, the consumer, in order to appease the social justice worker, which is funny because it's counteracted by another point on this very page. We don't agree with the capitalist assumption that starvation or greed are the only reasons people work. People enjoy their work if it is meaningful and enhances their lives. So right before this, the Democratic Socialists tell you how they're going to force your company to produce and operate, and then in the very next paragraph tell you, oh no, but we believe that if people are left to their own nature, they truly enjoy work, specifically the work that we force you to do. People will love the forced work we give them. Although a long-term goal of socialism is to eliminate all but the most enjoyable kinds of labor, we recognize that unappealing jobs will long remain. Is there anything more leftist social justice warrior entitled millennial than wanting to eliminate all the icky jobs? Jobs like septic cleaning, trash man, snow removal, basically any high-paying skilled job that millennials refuse to do as they pursue their 8-year degree in gender studies. These tasks would be spread among as many people as possible, rather than distributed on the basis of class, race, ethnicity, or gender as they are under capitalism. Rather than distributed on the basis of race, class, ethnicity, what? Nothing is distributed under capitalism. Nobody says, I need this trash picked up. You, black man, do this. Also, I won't pay you.
Hey, fuck your mama.
Thank you very much.
That's the beauty of free enterprise. Not only does it create a truly free market of ideas, goods, and services, but jobs for people who are willing to perform those jobs if people are willing to pay them for it. No government force required, which brings us to the linchpin. Although no country has fully instituted democratic socialism, the socialist parties and labor movements of other countries have won many victories for their people. We can learn from the comprehensive welfare state maintained by the Swedes, from Canada's national healthcare system, France's nationwide childcare program, and Nicaragua's literacy programs. See, this is what every failed economic system does, whether it's communism, socialism, or democratic socialism. No, it would work, just nobody else has done it yet. All the other people didn't do it right, but I will. And then they cherry pick data from individual facets of countries in order to make their point. Like Nicaragua's literacy program. Okay, why don't you talk about their GDP? Canada's nationalized healthcare system? Why don't you talk about the crushing debt in a Supreme Court case that ruled it a violation of human rights in 2005? Sweden? It's now the rape capital of the Western world and on the verge of cultural and economic collapse. Good for you, Sweden. You finally pulled one out. Oh, but that's right. The failsafe is these places weren't real democratic socialism. Not like these people want to do. We just have to trust them. Speaking of trust, let's move to some of the most notorious supporters of democratic socialism. Noted
neurosurgeons at the Young Turks.
And so many people who would really benefit from his policy ideas are against him because they've bought into the Bernie Sanders fear-mongering.
Up, she said fear-mongering. Drink. Trigger warning. If you play that game, you're gonna get hammered.
They hear the word socialist without really understanding what it means. Why is it that the middle class and the working class pays a higher percentage of their taxable income to the federal government, and then you have these massive multinational corporations not paying anything in taxes?
Because you're comparing corporations versus individual income? Couple of things here. Under Bernie Sanders, noted Democratic socialist, the middle class would pay more. A lot more. Yeah, if you're making $50,000 a year, you'd be paying over $5,000 more a year, so there's that. I know, some of you are saying, but we'll get free health care in college. Again, if you believe that everyone in government is beyond corruption and those things will happen efficiently. Again, let's go back to the analogy, health care. Like the post office, only add cancer. College, this goes back to the worldview. What if I don't want to go to college? What if someone decides, again, human nature, out of their own free will to take that job cleaning septic tanks that millennials refuse to do and he gets paid well? Why should he be taxed more to fund your decision to college? There's the practical and there's the moral. But back to the rocket scientists at the Young Turks. The whole reason for lower corporate tax rates is to avoid punishing the umbrella so that it has more money to give out to individuals, which, ironically enough, are now taxed at a higher rate. So what do you think happens if you tax these corporations, these umbrellas, more? Are they going to take it on the chin or fire employees and pay them less?
Yes, we have the highest corporate tax rate of any developed country, but when you consider the deductions and the loopholes, we have the lowest.
Wait, which party is it, again, that wants to do away with complicated tax codes and loopholes? Is it? Someone get me a reference.
Free market means that the rich people rig the market in their favor.
No, it does not. It's actually rigged by people like Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, or would-be Bernie Sanders, big government bureaucrats who get to legally determine how the system operates. Again, democratic socialism necessitates trust that all of these people are beyond corruption and will do what's right for you.
Which is why when we're in the middle of economic boom times, which we are right now, corporations are making record profits. Wall Street is at record highs.
Right off the bat, this goes back to a worldview. Wall Street at record highs. So, equities are the single greatest wealth creation tool that have been afforded to a populace since ever. If you have a 401k, retirement, you've invested it all, guess what? You want Wall Street to do well. Bailing out Wall Street is bad. We agree. But Wall Street doing well is not inherently bad for the middle class. In 2009, largely inspired by a rant from Rick Santelli against the big Wall Street bailouts, Tea Partiers protested big government and crony capitalism long before Young Turks or Bernie Sanders came around calling them racists. Occupy Wall Street? They're just copycats who smoked more weed.
Debauchery, violence, murder, suicide, and the ultimate end of the marijuana addict. Hopeless insanity.
They rig that system so that you don't get the benefit of your labor. So when, even though you're working harder, producing more, you don't get to benefit. You don't get to, you don't get any of that money.
Okay, democratic socialists, let's fix that. How about the middle class, the middle tier workers tie their job entirely based to performance. Go. You want them to benefit from their labor proportionally to the corporation? Okay, now all of those employees, just like the top earners in a down year, get nothing and have to fund all of those bleak years out of their own pockets. But if the company is successful enough to do well, despite the fact that 80% of businesses fail, the employees get paid handsomely. Oh, that's right. Unions have opposed that for decades. Better teachers should be paid more, bad teachers less. Now, okay, American auto workers, you'll get paid more when our reliability ratings go up and sales go through the roof. Now, see, the reason employees are paid less and the reason for this contract is because unlike the business owner, creator, innovator, you decided to forego the risk in order to receive financial security. It's a choice you made. You didn't start the business. You didn't risk your livelihood. You collected a check regardless of annual profits from someone who did.
What are they going to do with that disposable income? Are they going to do what millionaires and billionaires in the United States are doing, where they just kind of hoard it and they put it in either an overseas account or in a U.S. account and just kind of sit on it?
This is so beyond stupid it defies reason. How do you think millionaires and billionaires got to be that way? By keeping a pile of gold like Scrooge McDuck? No. The only way to become financially successful in a true free enterprise system is through investment
and willingness to incur risk.
They're going to go out there and spend the money. They're going to buy cars. They're going to, fortunately, hopefully one day, for people like me, buy a house, right? Yeah. They're going to actually go into the economy and they're going to spend that money. They're going to go out to eat. They're going to go out to malls and buy gifts during Christmas time. Whatever it is, they spend that money, and that's what stimulates the economy. And when people are buying shit, companies are kind of forced to hire more people so they can deal with the demand, okay? But if we're dealing with a situation where people don't have disposable income, they're not going to go out there and spend anything.
Yes! Yes! That's what I'm talking about! Young Turks with a grasp on basic economics. You're getting it. That's exactly it. Create an environment where there are more jobs and goods and services can be provided at an affordable market price. It's what Adam Smith referred to as the invisible hand, the market that set prices in demand. So you're catching on, as you said, with lower taxation, less government red tape, putting money back in the pockets of the consumer. I'm proud of you.
You're being robbed, not by socialists, but by the established economic system that we've got in America right now.
If you like this video, subscribe. Also, my producer, Nake Jared, does fine work. He's in need of employment. I recommend him highly.
Time for a rebuttal video. This one's here by popular request. The Vox video on gun control has picked up some steam. I'm surprised no one's addressed it. So, right off the bat, let me tell you, we'll address why this is propaganda. And it's not a word that I use lightly. People can disagree, and sometimes they have different facts or sources. Propaganda can only be used as a label when they knowingly mislead you, which is the case with this Vox video, as we'll prove. It's long, so let's get to the video.
The United States has a problem with gun violence.
Dramatic music.
In our hearts, perhaps we may never fully.
Is this Vox video or Cider House Rules?
We talk about it after mass shootings, but it's much larger and more complicated than those debates allow. Here's what you need to know about the state of gun violence in America. It's true that the U.S. sees many more mass shootings than these other developed countries. Between 2000 and 2014, there were 133 mass shootings in public populated places. That's excluding gang violence and terrorism.
So before we get to the point-by-point debunking, which we'll do, here's the important through line. She uses the term mass shooting. Well, mass shooting isn't a legally defined term. It's not even specifically defined in her source that she includes. We'll bring it up here on the screen. There isn't universal agreement as to what a mass shooting is, which is why it's hard to compile data. It's sort of like comparing violent crime rates. Different places have different standards. So it's important to note that because they're going to use this umbrella term, mass shooting, to plant the idea in your head. And we'll get to this very specifically. But they want to plant the idea in your head that with a rise in legally owned firearms, you see an increase in violent gun crime, which is patently false. It's entirely untrue. So it's important to note they're using mass shooting as the umbrella to make that point. Now, right away, the chart she uses is misleading because it's not even per capita. The United States has more population than many of these countries combined. When you look at her original source at PolitiFact adjusted for per capita rates, the chart is nowhere near as drastic, with even Norway, Switzerland, and Finland having more fatalities and deadly mass shootings.
Of course, the U.S. is a much larger country, but if you adjust for population size, it still ranks higher. Of these countries, Finland is next, with just 2 shootings over 14 years, but a much, much smaller population.
This is what's misleading. She specifically uses number of mass shootings, not victims or deaths, because even though you see this here, Norway and Finland are comparable relatively in frequency, they have a much higher death toll on average than American mass shootings.
And this type of tragedy seems to be happening more often in the U.S.
They say seems to be an increase in mass shootings because what they don't tell you is that violent crime has decreased. Again, an umbrella non-defined term like mass shooting is much more easy to manipulate than the legal standard of crime, which has gone down.
Each of these squares represents a public mass shooting with 4 or more fatalities. Before 2011, they happened 6 months apart on average. But since then, only 2 months go by between them.
This is interesting too, whereas before she was cherry-picking data, was kind of vague. All of a sudden, she's very specific in narrowing this criteria to psychopathic outliers whose name you will remember, like Columbine, Virginia Tech, Sandy Hook. Also interesting to note, with the exception, I think, of Luby's, I'm not entirely sure, occurred in gun-free zones. Luby's, of course, only being a decent food-free zone.
During my tenure as president, to offer my condolences to families in these circumstances.
That was October 1st, 2015. And just about 2 months later,
Yesterday, a tragedy took San Bernardino.
San Bernardino? Okay, hold on a second. I thought all these stats were excluding gang violence and terrorism. That was what they said at the outset. This is important later on. Now we're talking Islamic ISIS sympathizers who yelled Allahu Akbar and opened fire, and we're tossing it into the same statistic as Tommy finding daddy's revolver in the secret drawer? It's okay, I'll forgive her. Even Barack Obama himself still has San Bernardino not listed as terrorism, but gun violence. Wouldn't want to offend those Muslims. Let's go back to taking away your Second Amendment rights.
Public mass shootings get all the attention because they're often so indiscriminate. But the truth is, mass shootings are unlike most gun deaths in America. Here's how it breaks down. According to the most recent data, 92 people are killed with guns every day on average. About 30 of those are homicides, of which maybe 1.5 at most can be considered part of mass shootings.
Real quick, because we'll come back to this, 80% of those gun-related homicides in the United States are drug-related. Let's go.
Most of those killed, 58 people a day, are suicides. The rest are accidental shootings, police actions, and undetermined incidents. Those suicides, they show up in international comparisons too. These are the 10 countries ranked highest on human development by the UN.
She wants to ignore that because we want to get to American suicide. Suicide is a terrible thing. But to use it as a political tool to remove law-abiding citizens' basic human right to self-preservation is pretty terrible too. The reality is that per capita, the United States does not have an abnormally high suicide rate. Here are the countries that do. Surprise, many of these places are unfree countries with highly regulated gun control.
These are the 10 countries ranked highest on human development by the UN. The US has the highest suicide rate among them, and this darker bar shows how many of those are with guns.
So now the chart she cites is specifically countries ranked highest on human development from the UN. Not countries with the highest suicide rates, not even developed countries, which you could say would be fair, you know, as opposed to comparing Zimbabwe and the United States. She picks a very specific vertical for what to include. Sorry, South Korea, Japan, and Poland. Apparently, you're not developed countries. That Samsung Galaxy is a figment of your imagination.
But to go and think that some type of gun control regulations that are being talked about are going to stop somebody from committing suicide when there's so many other ways for people to commit suicide.
But the methods that people use are important because suicide attempts often stem from temporary crises. The vast majority of people who survive suicide attempts don't end up dying from suicide, but guns make it nearly impossible to get that second chance. The victims of gun suicides are overwhelmingly men and mostly white.
Now we get into the personal stories that hit you right in the feels. I do understand that it might be hard to compare suicide rates across different countries because of cultural differences. So an example that you do have would be looking at Australia before and after the gun ban. And the suicide death rate remains virtually unchanged. Though it is interesting to see Vox say that suicide is, correctly, mainly a white male problem. Check your privilege, and he's dead. To sum this up, the United States does not have a high suicide rate. Banning guns has not proven to be effective in diminishing suicide. And if I'm going to give my own personal opinion, suicide is terrible, but it doesn't infringe on somebody else's rights. So that's a decision you have to make. We have to move on because now there's a switch.
And the rate of gun suicides has been increasing in the US. At the same time, the rate of gun homicides has been decreasing, especially since the 90s when crime rates in general were higher. But if you compare the US to other developed countries, it doesn't look like good news. These are homicides adjusted for population size. The US would probably have a higher homicide rate even without guns, but you can see how gun violence pushes that rate far beyond the other countries here. The victims of these shootings, they're not the ones you often see on the national news. They're disproportionately young black men.
Just like that, we've switched from suicides to homicides without skipping a beat to make some kind of a racial point. Again, 80% of homicides in the United States are drug-related, and the United States is nowhere near the top of any chart for murder rate or even firearm deaths. Notice how now, unlike before, she's using a stat that includes gang crime. That 80% drug-related homicide might play a factor here.
You guys can leave here and go on with your lives, but we gotta go home to empty rooms because our children's lives were taken away by people who should not have had guns anyway.
Ooh, She's yelling at me like I shouldn't have a gun. Again, anecdotal information to personally manipulate the viewer. Now, it's sad that this lady lost her son, but her son was shot by gang members. Statistically, gang members aren't buying their heat at Walmart. As a matter of fact, one of the shooters involved in this incident already was a criminal not legally capable of purchasing a gun, regardless of whether the gun was legal in the first place. Side note, Chicago has some of the strictest gun laws in the country, also the highest homicide rate.
One possible explanation is that the US simply has more crime than those other countries. But if you set aside homicides for a moment and look at rates of burglary or assault, you don't see that same spike that you see with homicide.
Pause. Interesting fact about burglary. In the UK, with strict gun control laws, mind you, 59% of burglaries are what they call hot burglaries, which means the person is home when the house is burgled. At least they're going to say, you're being burgled. It's not as intimidating. As opposed to the United States, where only 13% of burglaries occur when the resident is home. For reference, hot burglaries have a much higher potential for violent conflict. I wonder what could be deterring said hot burglaries stateside. This is why it's important to know when you're being manipulated when someone's switching between stats that include gang violence and terrorism until they don't. Because yes, the United States certainly has more gang-on-gang crime. Europe has a startling trend of more predator against defenseless victim crime. A big factor for that we'll address later on in this video that she never mentions.
It's not that America has much more crime. It's that crime in the US is much more lethal. Altogether, the number of gun deaths in the US from 2000 to 2013 exceeds the number of Americans killed by AIDS, by illegal drug overdoses, the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, and terrorism combined. It should be clear by now that this level of gun violence is a uniquely American problem among the developed world.
First off, why does she throw AIDS in there? AIDS is not a serious problem for most Americans unless involved in, shall we say, very specific activities. Why would you include drugs on that list, but not the fact that 80% of gun homicides are drug-related? Also, how are war casualties not gun-related? Is this only mortar fire? Is it waterboarding outliers? What? I'm also imagining this would be skewed, considering that San Bernardino would be included down here and not up here with terrorism.
It should be clear by now that this level of gun violence is a uniquely American problem among the developed world.
This is important here because she finishes on the words gun violence, but this big scary black bar is not indicative of gun violence. It's total firearm-related deaths. That's important because when comparing actual gun homicide rates worldwide, the United States only ranks 28th. This is a pivotal sleight of hand here because this includes total firearm deaths right before she pivots.
This level of gun violence is a uniquely American problem among the developed world. And here's one reason why. There are a ton of guns in the US. This chart shows the estimated number of guns by country. It's adjusted for population size, and it's still not even close.
See, now this chart is comparing countries. But this chart is not about homicide. It's not about firearm deaths. It's only about gun ownership. All of this is designed to lead you into believing that gun ownership, legal gun ownership, results in increased violent gun crime. Important to note, if gun ownership, as seen in this chart, is so much higher, but the United States still ranks 28th in gun-related deaths, why is that the case? It also ironically unravels her own point. If gun ownership is so drastically higher in the United States, but we're only 28th ranked in overall gun homicide rate, that means proportionally legal gun owners in the United States are committing fewer crimes.
If you take a look back at the 10 countries with the highest levels of human development, you can see that it's really easy to get a gun in the US. All of the other countries require a license to purchase most guns, and those purchases are recorded into an official registry. To get that license, people have to state a reason for why they want a gun. And in most of these countries, they have to pass a safety test and are required by law to store their guns safely.
First off, it's funny how they put right to bear arms, singling out the United States as a negative here in this chart, which is tipping their hand because that's ultimately their end goal. But they'll tell you you're crazy, you're paranoid if you think that leftists just want to take your guns away. Brief history lesson. The United States has a Second Amendment because of a very different history than these other countries. Unlike Canada, for example, who bent over for the king, the United States decided to fight for freedom. And we wanted to hang on to that right to ensure that we were never taken over by a tyrant like, I don't know, say Hitler. Something else to note, along with the 80% drug-related gun homicide, is most gun crime occurs in heavily populated areas, urban areas, big cities. And the United States has more big cities than many countries on this list combined, which is why many crime bureaus readily admit that comparing violent crimes across different countries is nearly impossible to do.
In part because of its lax laws, there are well over 300 million guns in the US, and counting. This chart doesn't reflect private sales, but it shows the number of background checks, which all federally licensed dealers have to run. It suggests that the demand for guns has been increasing steeply since Barack Obama took office.
This part is absolutely true, despite how hard it is to trust someone who can't properly spell Obama, I know. With Barack Obama's demagoguery, people were concerned, and many did exercise their Second Amendment right for the very first time. Hence the legal background checks. Oh no, wait, that's a bad thing now. Side note, violent crime has still been decreasing. Matter of fact, firearm-related homicides have gone down a whopping 39% from 1993 to 2011. Which is important to note because this steep, scary graph is designed to plant the idea in your head that more legal gun owners equals more gun crime. Not true. Matter of fact, in a study in 1994, they found that only 21% of gun crimes involved a firearm purchase through a store or traditional outlet, meaning legally. The most recent study would suggest that it's closer to between 3 and 11%. There's a variance because these issues are kind of hard to study. Felons aren't known for their truthful integrity. Again, this unravels her argument, because regardless of background checks, the amount of gun crime committed by legal firearm owners is either the same or very likely lower than before, rendering this graph irrelevant. Next point.
So we've looked at gun deaths and at gun ownership. This chart puts them together. It shows that among highly developed countries, the more guns in a country, the more gun deaths. You can see that countries like Switzerland, which have relatively more guns than a country like the Netherlands, also have a higher gun death rate. And here's the US.
See the sleight of hand? We were just talking about homicide and gun purchases. Now we're back to gun deaths, not homicide or violent crime, because those would include suicides or violent intruders or criminals being killed by law-abiding gun-owning homeowners.
Likewise, US states with more guns have more gun homicides. There are outliers like Idaho, which has higher rates of gun ownership but low rates of gun murders. But overall, there's a correlation between gun ownership and homicide rates. And that relationship has held up in studies that control for things like poverty, unemployment, and crime.
Actually, no. Those outliers can be explained because there's a strong correlation between gun deaths and big populated cities and gang violence. That's why the sleight of hand is important. Sometimes she includes it, sometimes she doesn't. And if this particular study doesn't include big cities but poverty, it renders it irrelevant because poverty is still the biggest indicator for violent crime, far more so than mere gun ownership.
The correlation between gun ownership and gun deaths is even stronger for suicides. It makes sense.
No, it doesn't. None of it does. Look behind you. There's what made sense.
Depression with a gun is more dangerous than depression without one.
Okay, this again brings us back to the fact that the United States does not have an abnormally high suicide rate. So now she wants to blame the conjoining of guns and depression. But earlier she admitted that middle-aged white men make up an abnormally high percentage of the suicide rate, even though women are more likely to suffer from depression. So again, the mind trickery. We've gone from blaming the gun to now blaming depression and the gun, which counteracts her previous statement on suicides to begin with.
Likewise, fights, domestic disputes, road rage, drunkenness, all much more dangerous with a gun than without. That said, you might need different policies to keep guns away from potential mass shooters than you would to keep them out of inner city gangs or out of the hands of someone who might hurt themselves. America doesn't have a gun problem. It has several of them.
Okay, so here's the big takeaway. This video has equally represented mass shootings, suicide, and gang violence as though they proportionally contribute to the gun-related problem. Despite the fact that 80% of gun homicides in the United States are drug-related, despite the fact that the biggest indicators of gun crime are big, populated areas and poverty, despite the fact that the United States is not even in the top 25 in firearm-related deaths, despite the fact that the United States does not have an abnormally high suicide rate, despite the fact that with increased legal gun ownership, gun crime has actually steadily declined, and despite the fact that Vox had a beautiful canvas to work with at the outset by using the umbrella term mass shooting, which was completely undefined and even included acts of terrorism like San Bernardino. It's one thing to get your information wrong. It's another to deliberately mislead people because the facts don't stack up with your narrative. So when you look at the actual statistics and data that we've presented here, There are some solutions where we could find common ground, things like Project Exile, which we've covered at the website, where you have harsh penalties for felons illegally carrying firearms, things that deter criminals from getting firearms or carrying firearms, because that is where the problem truly lies. But they'll never present this information to you at Vox. Let's assume for a second that you believed everything Vox presented here to be true, that the United States had a staggeringly high suicide rate, abnormally high homicide rate, that there was a correlation between legal gun owners and gun violence and firearm-related deaths. How could you fix that problem? That's important. They've already shown you. It wouldn't be some kind of an arbitrary assault weapons ban, which really these weapons don't comprise of most of this gun violence anyway. It wouldn't be some kind of a limitation on magazine capacities. It would have to be, of course, an all-out gun ban, declaring that you legally do not have the right to self-preservation, which is in fact what several Supreme Court justices argued before the High Court, that none of you have the right to own firearms, period, for any reason unless your jurisdiction deems it so. But don't worry, you're just crazy thinking that people like Vox want to take your guns away. This is important right now because you hear this taught a lot. It's taught across colleges. It's taught on campus, and it's taught in the media. It's taught in the entertainment industry. Today, whenever we're talking about the unspeakable acts committed in the name of Islam across the world in record numbers, what is it that we're inevitably told?
But the Crusades.
All right, don't ever use that voice again. But the Crusades. As a matter of fact, it's so commonly used. Here's a montage.
Remember that during the Crusades and the Inquisition, people committed terrible deeds in the name of Christ.
Why are only Muslims mentioned in talks about religious extremism? Did y'all forget about the KKK? Westboro Baptist Church, Crusades. We all have the bad seeds in the family. Why?
The Muslims didn't go up from Jerusalem and march up to Europe to attack Christendom. No, the Christians marched down to Jerusalem to attack the Muslims.
The Crusades and the Inquisition. He went to the big ones, the ones where it's like everybody agrees. Woo, that was f***ed up, wasn't it?
And a lot of you probably believe that too, so it is time to get your paper plates, knife, and fork ready because we're about to have a sacred cow cook-off. It's a nice little graphic there. Assured to get us some letters. So let's get through these myths. If you've been taught about the Crusades, I'll call them the Second Crusades. The retaliatory Crusades, I'll explain in a minute because it's important, that they were unprovoked, that it was just Christians running across the globe with pointy hats and swords, killing any and all Muslims they could find, innocent or not, simply because they didn't like their brownness. It couldn't be further from the truth. Now, it's important because this is taught in schools across the country. A lot of people believe this. The fact is that these Crusades, the Second Crusades, they were a response to the First Crusades from Islam, from the Muslim onslaught for hundreds of years. For over 400 years, there was consistent Muslim expansion, aggression, violence. Muslims took Jerusalem in 638 AD. They pillaged Rome in 846 AD. Christian Spain and Portugal in 711 AD. Sounds like a gas station, but it's historical context that you need to know. That's why you tune in. Southern Italy during the 9th century. The Ottoman Turks were advancing into Europe and invading the Byzantine Empire. I think it was 1050, 1060 something AD. The Turks were marching into Asia, Syria, and then the big one, the big reason. So if you look at this map and you can see it expanding, was 1453, the capture, the sacking of Constantinople, which basically put an end to the Christian Byzantine Empire. And here's the thing. I understand military expansion, okay? So I'm not going to condemn the Islamic world for doing this back then, okay? Now, right away, that should change the context to the Crusades because people war and people go back and gain territory and win. But the sheer brutality from Islam, for example, they deliberately desecrated the burial sites of Peter and Paul.
Dick move.
In 846. Exactly. These are military terms you need not concern yourself with. They would behead people, as we see today. They had methods of torture that were incredibly brutal. The dimitude, meaning they would force non-Muslims to be subservient and pay taxes, and they didn't get to enjoy the same kind of rights as Muslims got to enjoy. Something we don't mention amongst our white guilt, millions, some people
estimate higher than 100 million died under the Arab slave trade. We have courses that we're forced to take here in the United States to learn about the evils of slavery that we stopped. Oh, are they teaching those? Anywhere across the Islamic world? Is there Islamic guilt? Is checking your Islamic privilege a thing? So this kind of brutality, this kind of inhumane treatment, and yes, military expansion and cultural expansion is what led to the retaliatory crusades. People like Vlad the Impaler, you've probably heard of. Do you know Vlad the Impaler?
Commonly known as Dracula, I believe.
Dracula is how he's known. Yeah, Vlad the Impaler was an actual person.
Some sucked.
Little bit of a sadist. I'll give that to you. Vlad the Impaler became really brutal precisely because he was a prisoner and saw the inhumane treatment, saw the brutality from the Islamic Empire. That's why he's seen as a folk hero to some. Now, I would say he went a little too far the other direction with impaling people and allegedly drinking blood.
He found the line.
He found the line, but...
It's good for him. He found it. You find it and then you dance back.
But they heard the message loud and clear.
It's true.
He was one of the few people who fought them off. He was using Verizon back then while everyone else was on Sprint. They got the message.
He was ahead of his
they
time.
Vlad incurred no roaming charges.
Like that.
I do. So all of this is what led to the Pope putting forward the idea of a Christian crusade for the first time that kind of gave license to killing people who weren't Christians because they were facing the extinction, potentially, what they thought of their culture, of their way of life, to who they saw to be barbarians at that point. And it's important to remember that the Crusades, the retaliatory Crusades from the Christians at that time, met the criteria of the Just War Clause. They were thought of as an act of love in response to Muslim aggression. Historically, they met the criteria that was necessary. So that's a big myth that we know. Another one that we hear a lot, and that context matters, is that the Crusades are some sort of a source of modern Muslim aggression or angst toward the West. There are terms out there, often parroted by, of course, the Young Turks, Reza Aslan. You've probably, did any of you learn this in college where they talked about when Christians took Jerusalem in 1099? I should say took back Jerusalem. Yeah. Which is really what they wanted to do. They'll teach you when Christians took Jerusalem in 1099. No, when they took back Jerusalem. Kind of like when people talk about the War of 67 when Israel gained territory. They don't talk about how many countries, was it Egypt, Jordan, I'm going to remember the third one, were teaming up to eviscerate them, and Israel just happened to kick their asses and took their land for protection. It's left out. So when Christians took back in 1099, you've heard this term, right? That their siege of Jerusalem, blood. They had blood up to their knees. You might have heard it. It's a term thrown around a lot. Even so much so that Bill Clinton said this after 9/11, mind you. The context matters. In trying to be sympathetic and show his tolerance and how progressive he was to the terrorists and terrorist supporters across the Islamic world, Bill Clinton had this to say: those of us who come from various European lineages.
Can you do it in Bill Clinton? Yeah, try that.
Are not blameless. Indeed, in the First Crusade, when the Christian soldiers took Jerusalem, they first buried a synagogue with 300 Jews in it. I was going to say that's unnecessarily dark to do it in a Bill Clinton voice. And proceeded to kill Muslim women, Muslim children, at the Temple Mount. I want to get down to the part where he said, the description of the event describes soldiers walking on the Temple Mount, a holy place to Christians, with blood running up to their knees. The common term, he reiterated it. I can tell you that story is still being told today in the Middle East, and we are still paying for it right after 9/11. First off, that's physically impossible for blood to be up to your knees, of course. And by the way, it may sound like we're trying to take something literally that they meant figuratively. No. They will teach this in college literally, and Bill Clinton meant it literally. Steve Weidenkopf pointed out that this is not only physically incapable, but corrected the record regarding the Jerusalem battle. Standard practice at the time dictated that a city that refused to surrender at the sight of a sieging army would suffer any and all consequences of a successful siege. This is why many cities back then agreed to terms before commencement of this siege. It doesn't mean all Muslims did that. They didn't necessarily follow the rules of war, as we've seen now. They didn't really follow any civil rules of engagement. The point is, 11th century warfare was harsh. This shouldn't be a surprise. Yes, the retaliatory Christian crusaders did kill many inhabitants, but the events are not out of the ordinary. And modern accounts, like Bill Clinton, when they throw it out there, they're used to stir up backlash against the West. They're the ones who are stirring the backlash up against us here in the Western world. They're the ones who are encouraging people in the Islamic world to use it as an excuse, because the Crusades were largely forgotten and they weren't used as justification for ISIS, for Taliban, for take your pick for that rule of the day. And here's something I would like to put forward. You know what? Not only is it understandable now, given this context, that the Crusades occurred, the Crusades were necessary. They had to happen. I'm not condoning the loss or the taking of innocent life deliberately, but the Crusades as a military and cultural response needed to happen because they happened precisely to stop the kind of barbaric behavior that you see in the Islamic world today. And you saw up until today in any other place where the Islamic empires were able to conquer. Let's talk about the Armenian genocide, where thousands upon thousands of people were killed brutally, including the crucifixion of young girls. Don't tell Cenk. I still don't know how Anna Kasparian sits next to him. Let's just don't talk about it. It only gets him mad. In the 1800s, Sunni Muslims killed over 4,000 mostly civilians in the city of Shia, beheading their king. They still behead in the Islamic world. You've seen these headlines. This still occurs all across the Islamic world. I'm not only talking about ISIS, but in places like Saudi Arabia. In some of these places in the Islamic world that actually have modern technology, you would consider them here in the New World, beheadings occur in soccer stadiums as a warm-up act. We get Beyonce's nipple, they get a head rolling around being kicked for a goal. I'm just saying that the reason the Crusades occurred were to stop the kind of behavior that shock you every single day when you read the news from the Islamic world. Because guess what? That was going to be the entire world. Even today, ISIS and their ilk are still forcing non-Muslims into dhimmitude with taxes and violations of basic human rights. And here's the main point. Whenever religious Islam has been given the opportunity to congregate, given a petri dish, in contrast to the rest of the modern world, to the rest of Western civilization, Europe, the United States, the Islamic world, when given the opportunity to civilize, when given more time, doesn't get better, doesn't make progress. It almost always gets worse. It gets worse. And that's what was happening before the Crusades because of the Islamic Crusades, and that would have occurred across the entire world. It's not one of those issues. Leftists like to act. Sometimes they'll use this argument, right? That, well, Christians have come a long way if you go back to the Crusades. They were pretty uncivil, and some members of Islam are just in that. It's like that phase for them where they need to get beyond it. No, Christians before the Crusades did become much more civilized, were advancing into the New World. Then because of Islamic onslaught and behavior, they had to get down in the dirt. The Crusades occurred, and they continued to make progress. By contrast, anywhere in the Islamic world where what they expanded into with their Crusades has been allowed to continue, it has gotten worse and darker. And if you're a progressive and you feel the need to appease it,
hey, if you like this video, subscribe by clicking the button that says subscribe. If you're not aware of it now, there's no way you're learning the internet at this point. I'm not going to help you. But this was clipped from my daily show, available exclusively to louderwithcrowder.com/mugclub members. If you're a student, military, or veteran, entering that promo code, it's less than $6 a month, and you get daily content. No more clips, plus this hand-etched mug. Oh, when I feel it, I got a chill like on the inside.